My own son pushed me off the back of the boat to silence me forever. The last thing I heard before the cold water swallowed me wasn't his voice crying out in horror. It was his wife laughing. I am Edward Calloway. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years as a cardiologist, listening to the hearts of broken people, patching them back together, sending them home to the families I always assumed loved them. I thought I was good at reading people. I thought I could tell when something was wrong. I was wrong about the most important patient I ever had, and that patient was my own son. 48 hours ago, I was a husband, a father, and a grandfather with a lake house in the Ozarks that I had built with my own hands. Now I am lying face down in the mud at the edge of a dock, bleeding from a gash above my ear, listening to my son describe the current patterns of Lake Hartwell and why our bodies probably wouldn't surface until late spring. If you have ever trusted someone completely, only to discover that trust was the weapon they used against you, press that like button right now, because what I am about to tell you is going to make you want to check every lock in your house tonight. The weekend started the way these things always do. Innocent, even warm. My son Tyler called me on a Tuesday and said he wanted to do something special, a family weekend on the lake. Just the four of us, him and Brooke and Margaret and me. He said Brooke had been stressed and the lake always calmed her down. He said he missed his old man. He laughed when he said it, that easy laugh I had heard his whole life, and I felt something loosen in my chest the way it always did when he acted like the boy I raised. My wife Margaret looked up from her book when I told her. She pressed her lips together in a way that meant she had a thought she wasn't sure was worth saying. After 42 years of marriage, I can read that expression from across a room in complete darkness. I should have asked what she was thinking. I didn't. We drove down to the lake house on Friday afternoon. The dogwoods along the highway were just starting to bloom, white and pink against the green hills, and Margaret held my hand across the center console, the way she used to do when we were young. By the time we turned down the gravel road toward the water, I had convinced myself that whatever small doubts I'd been carrying were just the anxieties of an old man with too much time to think. Tyler met us on the dock. He looked tired in a way that good sleep doesn't fix, the kind of tired that lives behind a person's eyes. But he hugged me hard and called me Pop the way he always had, and I breathed in the smell of my son's jacket and let myself believe that everything was fine. Brooke stood on the porch above us. She was smiling, but the smile didn't climb all the way up to her eyes. I noticed it. I filed it away as stress and forgot about it within the hour. That night we ate grilled fish on the dock, and Tyler opened a bottle of wine I had been keeping for his 40th birthday next year. He said he'd found it in the cabinet and didn't realize it was special. Margaret kicked me gently under the table when I started to say something. I let it go. Wine is just wine. The next morning, Saturday, Tyler suggested we take the boat out, just a short run across the lake, he said. Watch the sunset from the water. It was something we had done every summer since he was 12 years old. I didn't notice that he had checked the weather and picked the calmest evening of the week. I didn't notice that he had steered us to the deepest part of the lake, away from the weekend fishing boats and the teenagers on jet skis. I didn't notice that Brooke had been texting someone steadily for the last 2 hours despite having no cell signal, which meant she'd downloaded those messages beforehand. Planned reading. Pre-loaded instructions. I only noticed when Tyler turned off the engine. It was the silence that made the hair on my neck rise. We were drifting in the middle of the lake, the shore a comfortable smear of tree line in every direction, and the motor had gone quiet without any announcement. I looked at Tyler. He wasn't looking at the sunset. He was looking at Brooke. Something passed between them. I have watched thousands of patients under pressure. I know what a human face looks like when it is doing something it has already decided to do. I saw it in Tyler's face in that moment, and my cardiologist's brain registered it as a cardiac arrhythmia registers on a monitor. A blip, an irregularity. Something is wrong. I opened my mouth. I never got to say a word. 2 hands hit my back. The impact was quick and efficient, not the panicked shove of anger but the deliberate push of someone who had rehearsed the motion. I went over the rail before my body had time to process the information. The cold water came up fast and brutal, hitting me like a wall of glass. Lake water in October in the Ozarks is cold enough to make your muscles seize on contact, and mine did exactly that. I went under. The world turned black and cold and roaring. I had swum competitively in college. My coach used to say that panic kills swimmers faster than water does. I don't know how much of that training was still living in my muscle memory 45 years later, but something in me refused to thrash. I kicked. I oriented myself toward the surface by finding the direction of the faint silver light above me, and I kicked. My head broke the water 20 feet from the boat. Margaret was screaming. I heard it before I could see anything, her voice cutting across the dark water, and then a second splash, and I understood that she had gone in after me. Whether she jumped or was pushed, I didn't know then. I know now. She was pushed. I swam toward her voice. My left arm was barely responding, the cold water and the shock compressing what I suspected was a dislocated shoulder, but I reached her in less than a minute. She grabbed me and I grabbed her, and we held each other in the dark water, treading, gasping. I started to call out to the boat. Margaret's hand clamped over my mouth under the water. I turned to look at her. The shock on her face had already transformed into something harder, something I had only seen from her once before, in 1998 when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit our car, and she held her broken arm against her chest and directed me to call 911 before she allowed herself to make a single sound of pain. She shook her head once. She pointed at the boat. I went still. I kept us afloat with the minimum movement possible, and I listened. Tyler's voice drifted across the water, unnaturally clear the way sounds carry over a flat lake at dusk. He wasn't calling our names. He wasn't throwing a life preserver. He was talking to Brooke in a low, rapid voice. And the words I caught, drifting to us on the wind like something poisonous, were these. The current runs south. By morning they'll be past the dam. Stop crying. You knew this was what had to happen. I stayed completely still in the cold, black water. Brooke's voice came back sharp and fast. Call it in now. 30 minutes is enough. They went out past the railing for a sunset photo, and they fell. You grabbed for them and you missed. You have to sound destroyed, Tyler. Can you do that? Can you sound like your heart is broken? A pause. Then my son's voice, quiet and deliberate. Yes, he said. I can do that. Margaret's fingers found mine under the water and squeezed so hard I felt my knuckle bones compress against each other. We didn't speak. We turned south, away from the boat, and we swam. The Ozark shoreline at night is not welcoming. It is rocky and steep and tangled with brush that tears at wet clothing and skin. It took us 40 minutes to find a place low enough to crawl out of the water, and by the time we lay on the stones gasping, my whole left side was screaming, and Margaret's teeth were chattering so hard I could hear them. The temperature had dropped below 50 degrees. I am a physician. I knew what was coming for us in terms of hypothermia, exposure, blood loss from the rock cuts. But I also know something that no amount of cold can touch. I know that the most dangerous thing in the wild is not the weather. It is the people who know you are out there. From where we lay, I could hear the boat motor restart in the distance. Tyler was calling it in. He was beginning the performance. And if we stumbled up to the road and flagged down a car and walked back into the story alive, we would be doing it soaking wet with a dislocated shoulder and a scalp wound, facing a son and daughter-in-law who were young and articulate, and already deep into their carefully rehearsed tragedy. We would lose. They had the story. We only had the truth. Margaret sat up and wrung the water from her hair. She was shaking so hard she could barely speak, but her eyes were absolutely steady. She looked at me and said 3 words, the old cellar. 20 years ago, when I laid the foundation of the lake house, I spent 6 months reading about severe weather and structural reinforcement. The Ozarks gets tornadoes. I built a storm shelter into the hillside 30 yards behind the house, reinforced concrete with a steel door and a separate entrance hidden behind the woodpile. I stocked it with emergency supplies and a landline phone that ran on an independent junction, separate from the house system. I connected it to a set of hardwired interior cameras I had installed throughout the house for security. I never told Tyler about it. I told myself at the time it was because children don't need to know everything about a house. The truth is that some part of me, the part that lived through 38 years of watching families fall apart in hospital waiting rooms, had always known that a man should have a place his family doesn't know about. A private structure, a personal foundation. I had never been more grateful for a paranoid architectural decision in my life. We circled wide through the trees, keeping off the path, moving in darkness that pressed down on us like a physical weight. My left shoulder was useless. I held my arm against my chest and I moved. Margaret was limping, but she didn't ask me to slow down. By the time we reached the woodpile, I was running on nothing but the cold fury that had replaced every other sensation in my body. The shelter door hadn't been opened in 4 years. The hinges fought me. Margaret and I pulled together, and the steel gave way with a screech that I was certain carried all the way to the water. We held our breath in the dark. The lake house lights were on. From our angle, we could see the dock, where Tyler stood with his phone pressed to his ear. His posture was theatrical grief, his shoulders hunched, his free hand covering his face, performing sorrow for whoever was on the other end of the line. I pulled my wife into the shelter and sealed the door above us. The emergency flashlight was where I had left it. The batteries were low, barely casting enough light to find the supply cabinet, but they held. There was a wool blanket, 2 Mylar emergency sheets, a first aid kit, and 4 cans of food. There was also a tablet computer I had stored in a waterproof case 7 years ago when I was going through a phase of reading about survival preparedness. It was dead, but the hand-crank charger still worked. And there were the cameras. The camera system was old, a closed-circuit feed that ran on a private wired network inside the walls of the house, completely separate from the Wi-Fi Tyler used on his phone. It fed to a small monitor inside the shelter that I had never once looked at in all the years since I installed it. I looked at it now. The screen flickered up in green-tinted black and white, and I watched my own house through the eyes of a dead man. I set Margaret's shoulder. She bit down on the corner of the emergency blanket and didn't make a sound while I reduced the dislocation with a technique I had performed on other people hundreds of times in my career. The pain of doing it to myself was a different category of experience. But when the joint slid back into alignment with a wet pop that I felt from my collarbone to my fingertips, the relief was immediate enough to make my eyes water. Margaret took over the first aid kit while I watched the screen. The sheriff arrived at 11 o'clock. I recognized him from the bait shop in town, a heavy man named Garfield, who had once told me my deck needed railing work before someone got hurt. He sat across from Tyler at the kitchen table. Tyler was wearing my flannel shirt, which he must have found in the bedroom closet, and his eyes were red and swollen from crying he had clearly been doing since the moment he made the call. I watched my son lie to law enforcement with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing for weeks. He told the sheriff that we had been leaning over the railing to take a photograph, that Margaret had slipped on the wet fiberglass, and I had grabbed her, and we had both gone over together, that he had reached for us and caught nothing but air. He demonstrated the reaching motion for the sheriff, his arm outstretched, his face a mask of helpless anguish. Brooke sat beside him and said nothing. She held a cup of tea and stared at the floor. She was playing the traumatized witness, leaving Tyler alone in the spotlight, making sure that the story had a single voice, a single liability. I knew then, watching her be that strategic while my body was still cold and my shoulder was still on fire, that Brooke was the architect. Tyler was the foundation. She was the building. Sheriff Garfield told Tyler that search and rescue would begin at first light, and that conditions on the lake were cooperating because the weather was calm. He used the word hope 3 times. He patted Tyler's arm. He left at 12:30, and as his headlights swept out of the driveway, the performance ended as cleanly as a curtain dropping. Tyler stood up from the table and exhaled. He opened the refrigerator and took out a beer. He opened it and drank half of it in one long pull and set the bottle down on the counter and said, with absolutely no tremor in his voice, "It's done." Brooke picked up her phone. She typed for 30 seconds. She set it face down. "Not yet," she said. "But close. I had raised that boy. I had taught him to ride a bicycle with one hand on the seat and the other on his shoulder. I had driven him to his first job interview and waited in the parking lot for 2 hours because he was nervous and didn't want me to leave. I had watched him marry this woman and thought, privately, that she was sharper than him in ways that might prove difficult. I had been right about that and wrong about everything else. I turned away from the screen. Margaret was watching me. She had wrapped herself in the wool blanket, and she was eating a cracker from the emergency tin, chewing slowly, calmly, her eyes tracking my face the way she had tracked patients' faces for 30 years of nursing. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad," I said. She nodded once and kept eating. It was Margaret who noticed the discrepancy 2 hours later, when we were watching Brooke move through the kitchen alone. Our family attorney, a man named Douglas Crane, who had handled our estate documents for 18 years, arrived at the house at 2 in the morning. That was the first odd thing. The second was that Tyler was asleep on the sofa with a sleeping pill, crushed dissolved in that second beer I had watched him drink, which Brooke had poured herself, and which she had described to him as just something to take the edge off. Douglas Crane did not ring the doorbell. He knocked twice, softly, in a pattern. Brooke opened the door before the second knock finished. She stepped into his arms. It was not the embrace of two people sharing grief. It was 12 seconds long. His hands moved to her face when they separated. He was smiling in a way that I can only describe as proprietary. Margaret made a sound beside me in the dark that I will not try to put into words. I watched them sit together at my kitchen table with the lights low, speaking in murmurs I could not fully hear through the monitor's small speaker. But I caught fragments, and fragments were enough. I heard the word policy. I heard 48 hours. I heard Douglas say something that ended with, before Tyler becomes a problem. I heard Brooke say, quite clearly, he thinks he's the one in control. Let him think that for a few more days. There it was, the second floor of the trap. Tyler had believed he was the mastermind. He had pushed his own parents into a lake to cover his debts and give himself a clean start. But Douglas and Brooke had been using him the way a boxer uses a sparring partner, getting the work done, absorbing the risk, and when the fight was over, he would be set aside. I reached into the corner of the shelter and found the waterproof case with the tablet inside. I needed to crank the charger for 20 minutes before the screen came on. Margaret took the handle and cranked while I sat with my back against the concrete wall and thought through the architecture of what was happening to us the way I would think through the anatomy of a failing organ. Where is the blockage? Where does the blood need to flow? What is the intervention point? Tyler had debt. I had found 3 envelopes from collections agencies in the mail at the lake house last summer, mixed in with the junk mail, and I had not mentioned them because Tyler had always been proud, and I had always been afraid of pushing him further away than he already felt. His real estate business had not been doing well for 3 years. He had come to me once, briefly, and asked about an advance on his inheritance, and I had said I wasn't comfortable with the idea, and the conversation had ended with a silence that lasted 6 weeks. That silence had apparently been filling up with plans I hadn't known were being made. I found what I needed on the tablet after 30 minutes of searching. The property filing records for Tyler's business were public. The second mortgage on his townhouse was public. The lien against his company was public. The piece I didn't have, the piece that connected Douglas Crane to Brooke before they had supposedly met as our family attorney, required a different kind of search. I found a photograph from a charity gala, 4 years old, hosted by the Bar Association. Douglas Crane, standing at a table with 6 other people, all named in the caption. One of the names was Brooke Helton, pre-marriage, listed as a paralegal at a firm across town. They had known each other for 4 years. They had known each other before Tyler had ever brought her home for Thanksgiving. I sat with that fact in the dark for a long time. Then I picked up the landline. The line was old, and the dial tone took a full 5 seconds to appear. But it was there, steady and clean. I called a number I had memorized in 1983 and had never needed to use for anything more serious than a golf reservation. My college roommate, Philip Marsh, answered on the third ring with the irritated voice of a man who had been asleep. He had retired 3 years ago from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Atlanta after a career that had ended organized crime careers across 2 continents. I heard him go quiet as I talked. Then I heard him go very still. "Ed," he said, when I finished. "I know," I said. "Are you injured?" "We're mobile. Are you safe where you are right now?" "For now." There was a pause during which I could hear him thinking. "I want to send people," he said. "I have 4 contacts 40 minutes from you who could have that house secured before sunrise." "No," I said. "If we come out now, we come out broken and bleeding, and the sheriff already has Tyler's story. We need more." "What do you need from me?" "I need the insurance claim flagged without being frozen. I need them to feel safe enough to sign. And I need you to come in person, Phil, because I need someone that Douglas Crane cannot lawyer his way around." Another pause. "I'll drive tonight," he said. "I'll call you when I'm close. And Ed, yes, I am very glad you are a strong swimmer. I set the phone down. Margaret was watching me from across the shelter. The mylar blanket was around her shoulders, and she had rebandaged my ear while I was on the call, and the room smelled like antiseptic and old concrete. She looked, in that moment, nothing like the woman who organized church fundraisers and grew tomatoes in raised beds on our back porch. She looked like the woman who had worked a 30-hour shift in the ICU during a hurricane and kept 3 patients alive using improvised equipment and what she later described as stubbornness. She looked like someone who was not done yet. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her everything. We did not sleep that night. We watched the house through the cameras, and we made a plan with the precision of people who had nothing left to lose but time. We ate crackers from the emergency tin, and Margaret inventoried the medical supplies, and I charged the tablet and photographed every piece of financial information I could find through the county records portal. By morning, I had the architecture of their plan laid out in front of me like a structural diagram. Douglas would fast-track the death certificates through his contacts in probate. The insurance payout of $3.8 million would be released to the estate. Tyler would receive it, pay off the loan sharks who were threatening him, and stabilize. Then, within some undefined but short window, he would become the grieving son who fell apart under the weight of the tragedy. A medical event, an accident, something quiet and clean. Brooke would inherit as the surviving spouse. She and Douglas would disappear somewhere comfortable. Tyler was a murder weapon who didn't know he was also the next target. We watched his face on the cameras all that day. He was unraveling. He moved from room to room holding his phone, checking the news about the search, pouring drinks he didn't finish. By afternoon, he was pacing the dock alone. From our low basement window, I could see the shape of him standing at the end of the dock in the gray October light, staring at the water. And something about that posture, that particular slump, reached back 40 years and grabbed me by the throat. He was 6 years old, standing at the edge of the town pool, terrified to jump, looking back at me with those huge brown eyes that were his mother's eyes and his grandfather's eyes, asking with his whole body if I was there, if I would catch him. I had always caught him, until he made sure I couldn't. I turned away from the window. Philip arrived the next morning in a black rental car wearing a suit that had cost more than Tyler's first car. He played the insurance investigator with the polish of a man who had spent 30 years playing characters in situations considerably more dangerous than a lake house living room. I watched on the screen as he laid out the paperwork on my coffee table and told Tyler the check had been cut and was ready to be delivered at the estate reading the following day. I watched Tyler's face transform. The fear dissolved. The guilt dissolved. Even the exhaustion seemed to lift slightly. $4 million has a way of doing that to a person who has been drowning in debt for 3 years. "Tomorrow morning," Tyler repeated, his voice almost reverent. 10 o'clock, Philip confirmed. "The attorney reads the will, the beneficiaries sign the waiver, and the check is yours." Brooke appeared at the top of the stairs. She had come down at the sound of the word check, the way a hawk arrives at the sound of something small moving through grass. "The signature is a formality," she said, descending the stairs carefully. "We can sign anything you need." Philip looked at her with a smile that reached his eyes, but not a single other part of his face. "I'll see you both tomorrow morning," he said, and left. That night, in the shelter, Margaret and I dressed. We put on the clothes we had been wearing when we went into the water. They were dry now, stiff with salt and lake mud and the dark brown residue of dried blood. My shirt was torn at the shoulder from the rock I had grabbed, climbing out of the water. Margaret's blouse had a tear along the collar. The scrape on my forearm had scabbed over into something that looked considerably worse than it was. The bandage on my ear was visible and ugly. She looked at me in the thin light of the flashlight. "We look like we came back from the dead," she said. "That's the point," I said. She straightened her back. She was 59 years old, and she had just spent 2 days in a concrete shelter on crackers and creek water, and she stood like a woman who had decided the situation required her full height. We moved through the pre-dawn dark to the back of the house. I had a key to the mudroom door. I always had a key. This was still my house. The living room at 10 the next morning was everything I had imagined from behind the screen. Douglas Crane at the head of the room, documents spread across my coffee table. Tyler on the sofa in a sport coat that was a size too large, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees. Brooke beside him, composed, wearing the quiet expression of a woman counting down a clock she believes only she can see. Philip at the fireplace, one hand in his jacket pocket, and Sheriff Garfield in the armchair, attending as a courtesy witness, holding his hat in both hands with the heavy face of a man honoring the dead. Douglas was reading the opening language of the will when Philip cleared his throat. "I apologize," he said. "Before the signatures, there's a procedural requirement, a final verification clause in policies of this value. The company requires a confirmation that no additional interested parties are present." Douglas looked at him with the controlled irritation of a man who believes he is the most powerful person in any room. "That's not a standard clause, Mr. Marsh." "No," Philip agreed. "It's not standard." He paused. "Neither is this." He walked to the hallway door and knocked twice. I don't know exactly what I expected to feel when I pushed that door open. I had imagined this moment for 2 days in the dark. I had rehearsed the entrance, the words, the posture, but standing in the threshold with my ruined shirt and my taped ear and my wife beside me, I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt 67 years old and furious, and tired of being lied to by the people I had fed and clothed and driven to dentist appointments and loved without condition for 4 decades. I looked at my son. He saw me, and every drop of blood left his face in a single second. The pen fell from his fingers and hit the floor and rolled under the coffee table, and no one moved to pick it up. Brooke screamed. It was a high, structural sound, the sound of something load-bearing giving way all at once. She shoved backward off the sofa and knocked over the floor lamp and pressed herself against the far wall with both hands up, palms out, as if she could ward off what she was seeing. Douglas Crane said nothing. He simply sat down in the armchair, slowly, the way very large things fall, and stared at the documents in front of him. Tyler looked at me. His mouth was open. He was trembling from somewhere deep inside his chest. "Dad," he said. The word barely had sound. I walked into the room. I did not rush. The crutch Margaret had fashioned for me from a piece of lumber made a sound on the hardwood floor with every step, a slow, deliberate knock that I felt resonating in my sternum. I stopped 6 feet from my son. "I want to ask you something," I said. My voice was not what it had been on Friday evening. It was rougher, slower, stripped down to something more basic, and I need you to think very carefully about whether you want to answer it in front of a sitting sheriff. Tyler stared at me. Tears were forming, but not the kind that come from grief, the kind that come from the complete and total collapse of a plan that has been holding a person upright. "It was her," he said, his voice breaking open. "She planned everything, Dad. I didn't want to. I didn't want any of this. I was scared. I was drowning, and she told me this was the only way out, and I—" "Stop," I said. I reached into my shirt pocket and placed a small digital recorder on the coffee table. "I've heard everything you've said in this house for the past 48 hours, I said. "Through the cameras you didn't know existed. So before you decide which story you want to tell, you should know that I already have yours." I pressed play. My son's voice filled the room from that small speaker. The words about the current, the words about the dam, the word "done," said with all the flatness of a man who has completed an errand. I let it run for 30 seconds. Then I stopped it. Sheriff Garfield was standing up. He was not holding his hat anymore. I looked at Tyler one last time. I looked for the 6-year-old at the edge of the pool. I looked for any piece of the person I had believed he was. I found only a man who had calculated the value of my life and found it acceptable. "There's one more thing," I said. I pulled the second document from my pocket. A laboratory report, dated 10 days ago. I had ordered it quietly after finding a receipt in Tyler's jacket pocket for a paternity consultation service. A receipt that suggested he himself had recently had doubts about a question he hadn't yet asked me. I set it on the table in front of him. He looked at the name on the report. He looked at the probability figure at the bottom of the page. Then he looked at Douglas Crane, who was staring at the window with the face of a man who has just realized the building he is standing in is already falling. Tyler stood up slowly from the sofa. His hands were still behind him in the position of a man waiting for cuffs that hadn't arrived yet. He looked at Brooke. He looked at the man who was his attorney, and was also, according to the document on the table, the biological father of the child his wife was carrying. Brooke moved toward the French door to the porch. Margaret, who had not spoken a single word since we entered the room, said no in a voice I had not heard in 42 years of marriage. Quiet, absolute, the voice of a woman who has been through 2 days that would have ended most people and has decided that calm is the most frightening thing she can offer. Brooke stopped. Sheriff Garfield crossed the room in 4 strides, and the sound of the handcuffs was the cleanest sound I had heard since Friday evening. We gave everything to our granddaughter, Sophie, Tyler's daughter from his first marriage, who had been sitting in a back row at the memorial service we had watched through the shelter window, wearing a dress that was too small for her, and holding a drawing she had made of Margaret and me that Brooke had taken from her hands and set face down on a table without a word. Sophie was 8 years old. She had done nothing wrong. She was collateral in a war she hadn't known was being fought. Philip administered the trust. The lake house went into it. The investment accounts went into it. The insurance policy, which Douglas had attempted to process and which the company had flagged per Philip's instruction, was voided under the Slayer statute that covers all 3 of them. They got nothing. We left the Ozarks the following week. We drove north with the windows down and the radio on and Margaret's hand on my arm, and we did not discuss what had happened until we stopped for dinner at a roadside place in Missouri, and she looked at me across a booth and asked if I was going to be okay. I told her I didn't know yet. I still don't know, entirely. There are letters that arrive from the penitentiary on a semi-regular basis, and I leave them in the kitchen without opening them until Margaret gathers them into a stack and carries them to the fireplace on Sunday evenings. We have never read one. We have made a decision together that reading them would be a form of continuing a conversation that ended at the edge of a dock in October. What I do know is this. I am a cardiologist. I have spent nearly 4 decades listening to the hearts of sick people, and the thing that decades of practice teaches you is not how to fix every broken thing. It is how to recognize when something cannot be repaired and needs to be removed, when leaving a damaged structure in place will kill the surrounding tissue, when the kindest and most necessary act of medicine is the one that looks, from the outside, like giving up. It is not giving up. It is triage. It is the decision to protect what is still healthy, rather than exhaust everything trying to save what is already gone. I saved my son's life twice with my own hands in hospital waiting rooms, once when he was 9 and once when he was 23. I would have saved it a 3rd time. I would have given him whatever he needed, whatever the amount, whatever it cost me, if he had simply asked. He didn't ask. He made a different decision. And now I have made mine. This fall we are taking Sophie to the coast. It will be her first time seeing the ocean. Margaret has already bought her a swimsuit, yellow with white flowers on it, and when I imagine the expression on that child's face when she sees the water for the first time, I feel something unlock in my chest that has been sealed tight since October. It is not forgiveness. It is not peace exactly. It is the quiet, particular satisfaction of a physician who has done everything that can be done and stepped back and watched the healthy tissue begin, slowly, to heal. If someone in your life is asking you to stand at the edge of something high and telling you not to worry, trust your instincts. The people who love you don't need you at the edge. They need you exactly where you are. This is Edward Calloway, and I am, against all reasonable expectation, still here. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your support is the reason I am still willing to tell the truth. Subscribe to Voice of Papa, and if you've ever had to make an impossible decision to protect your own peace, I want to hear about it, because surviving is only the beginning. What you do with the time after is what matters most. Until next time, watch your back and hold on to the people who earn it.